Welcome, everybody. We're going to give the panel about 30 more seconds to get everyone settled in. So please bear with us while we get started. Give your email one last check, and we'll be moving in about 30 seconds. I think that suffices. Welcome, everybody. Happy Climate Week. My name is Nick Aster. I'm Director of Marketing for North America for South Pole. Today's panel, The Path to Net Zero, is going to be an exciting conversation. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to give a few introductions and ultimately turn it over to our moderator. Vis-a-vis getting started, for those of you not familiar with South Pole, we are a sustainability consulting company and climate project developer. We're a B Corp and a social enterprise. Headquartered in Zurich, founded in 2006, and since then we've grown to be a truly global operation in dozens of countries on all continents. We work with hundreds of companies, organizations, and the public sector on reducing their carbon footprints and many other sustainability issues. We're well known for hosting exciting conversations on climate change, its relation to global well-being, and the action that companies can do to address it. This is, of course, a virtual conversation. The upside to that is that a lot more of us are going to be able to join than would otherwise be present in New York. So we look at that as a good opportunity to get to know you all. By now, you guys know the drill. Please excuse any weird sounds, children jumping into the screen, and the other things that come along with this virtual world that we're now living in. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes probably before we open this up to Q&A for everybody. If you're not familiar with GoToWebinar, you will see a little control panel off to the side of your screen. There's a tab that says questions. Please type any questions that you would like into that box. We will get to those questions toward the end of the chat. Most of the panelists have graciously agreed to stay a little later if things get really heated and exciting. But like I said, we'll try to get through those questions as quickly as we can. Just to set the topic a little bit in terms of where we're at, the concept of net zero is a very hot topic right now. Many companies are announcing that they have one goal or another, a timeline, and so on to reach this goal, yet there continues to be a little bit of confusion as to exactly what the concept of net zero means, as well as what one ought to do to set out on the path to achieving that goal. We have a number of folks here that have some different sector experience on what that means and how to get there, and so I'm confident that we're going to have a lot of different perspectives on the journey. Unfortunately, Sean Kinghorn from Intuit is unable to join us today. He had a family emergency, so he sends his apologies. If anyone has any Intuit or, for that matter, tech sector specific questions, please ask him anyway, and we're happy to forward those on to Sean to see if he has a chance to get to them later. Kai is also running a little bit late. Kai from Max Burgers in Sweden. We do hope he will jump in eventually. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our guest moderator, Jim Giles from the world famous GreenBiz organization. Was gracious enough to offer to jump in and share his expertise in guiding this conversation. We also have with us Erin Meezan. She is the VP and Chief Sustainability Officer at Interface, and of course Austin Whitman, who is the CEO and founder of climateneutral.org. Jim, you want to jump in and get us rolling?
I will. Nick, thanks so much. So as Nick said, my name is Jim Giles. I am the Senior Analyst for Carbon and Food Systems at GreenBiz, and I run or involved in running a conference called Verge. Really happy to be here. Welcome to Climate Week. It's always a week of I just find it overwhelming every year, the number of new things that we have to process. I don't think this year has disappointed. We had a major announcement from China, the world's largest emitter, about going carbon neutral by 2060, and I think we're all trying to figure out what that means, but it's potentially a game changer, I think. And as usual, we saw lots of announcements from corporates about new carbon commitments that they're making. One that caught my eye, by no means the only one, was from General Mills. I think the food sector is an area that hasn't produced a ton of headline-grabbing carbon commitments, but General Mills said it's going to go net zero by 2050. And of course, behind these announcements, or following on from these announcements, is a process that is, I think, for many people just really daunting. You know, you set the target and then the company has to do the really hard work of measuring, reducing, and if necessary, offsetting those emissions. And there are so many complexities in there that I think it is just extremely daunting when companies set out on this journey. The good news is that any company is setting out on this journey can look to leaders that have been there before. Oh, and hey, Kai, great to see you join us. As I was saying, it can look to leaders who are further ahead on this journey and can share some of the things that they've learned. And that's why this panel is great, because we have some of those leaders on this panel right now. So what I propose to do is just to go around and if each panel member could introduce themselves and just say a little bit about your company, and very quickly just state the commitment that you've made in terms of carbon. And we'll, not the details of how you're going to hit that, we'll get into that. Just tell us who you are, what you do, and how your company is committed to acting on climate. And Erin, let's start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Interface. We are a global flooring maker who has committed publicly that our mission is going to be to reverse global warming. And that led us to set a goal to be a carbon negative enterprise across all scopes of our business by 2040. And that ultimately means everything in our business and its supply chain must not just be carbon neutral, but will be carbon negative.
Great, thank you. Kai, same question to you.
Okay, so Kai Török, I'm Chief Reputation Officer and Chief Sustainability Officer at Max. We're a Swedish burger chain. We were born above the polar circle in Sweden, but we're expanding to Norway, Denmark, Poland, and even Egypt. And we have launched the world's first climate positive menu in 2018. So everything is climate positive, which I think is exactly the same thing as Erin means with carbon negative. So we're starting off with some confusion and some lineage or alignment at the same time.
Thanks, Kai. Yeah, maybe we should come back to that later on because that is confusing. So Austin, you play a kind of different role in this process. Tell us some more about that.
Yeah, it's good to get all those lingo jargon words up on the table at the beginning so we can sufficiently confuse everyone and then straighten out. People will feel at the end of it like they've really accomplished something because they actually understand it. Yeah, I laughed, Nick, when you were talking about the weird noises at, on virtual calls, because just this morning the utility decided to replace some aging natural gas infrastructure in our street and began digging up the road. So all the windows are shut and it still sounds like we're in Midtown Manhattan, which is great for Climate Week because we would have been there, and it's unfortunate that we're not. But yeah, Climate Neutral is a nonprofit organization we launched about 1.5 years ago. And we, as a small team, our goal was to mobilize sort of other companies to make climate commitments. And specifically, the certification that we have is really just a lot of the same familiar pieces of the puzzle, just assembled in our own particular way, which is immediate carbon neutrality. We believe the urgency of the climate challenge really demands that of all companies, and coupled with an ambitious reduction plan to reduce emissions over time. And then importantly, we believe it's really important to translate a company's work to the consumer, because that's effectively why, it's effectively how voluntary commitments are powered, is through consumer demand. So I have to take a moment to shout out REI, which is our latest brand. They just hit the wires this morning with an announcement that they were joining us, and we couldn't be more excited about that and all of the many consumers that they work with. So yeah, it's great to be here.
Great, and really exciting to hear about that, Austin. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so Erin and Kai, I want you to try and go back to the beginning of this journey then. So to remember what it looked like when you had a goal in mind, but you didn't have a process for achieving that goal. Just tell us about like maybe the two biggest things that you were thinking about, that you were concerned about, the two biggest things that you thought you'd have to tackle in order to hit that goal.
Sure. I mean, I'll start. You know, I have the privilege of working for a company that's not afraid to make an ambitious commitment without a plan. But I want to acknowledge that lots of other companies, that's one of the biggest barriers is, you know, convincing your CEO to even allow you to say net zero publicly sometimes requires them to do the data, do the mapping, do the analysis to even get that commitment. So I'm lucky to be in a place where, you know, my company was able to say, not only do we want to be neutral, we want to go negative. But I think the first biggest kind of gap there is really understanding where your biggest opportunities are. And as a product maker, whether it's, you know, wool runners or wool carpets or, you know, whatever product you're making, really understanding in your supply chain that impact. So for us, 98% of the total carbon footprint of our enterprise now comes from our supply chain. And 46% of that comes from the raw materials that we buy. So it becomes an immediate challenge around saying, it's not just about gearing ourselves up to make this commitment. It becomes a challenge of driving it within your own business, but then also subsequently in parallel, driving it with your supply chain. So in the manufacturing sector, you know, I kind of feel like we have this double challenge. We have to, you know, reimagine our company, get some wins, show how it's possible, and then turn around and kind of do that with our supply chain. And if you're a smaller manufacturer and you don't have the scale of a Walmart, you do a lot of convincing and educating and awareness. And so I think that's the first kind of big step is the data. And then the second is realizing you've got to kind of run a parallel process to make change in your company, but also in your supply chain.
And it's really interesting that you mentioned supply chain. So just to clarify, the 2040 target that you mentioned, that includes your Scopefree emissions.
It does. It does.
Great.
Absolutely. I mean, it has to, right? Given how significant it is in our business.
Yes, it has to.
I think it should, but it doesn't always. So let's come back to that because that's really critical. But Kai, tell us what it looked like for you at the beginning of this journey.
Okay, so we should probably go back to An Inconvenient Truth then, the movie with Al Gore. And the family Bergfors who owns Max, they were looking at that again and again and thinking, maybe we're part of the problem. How would we know? So the first major thing for us was to do the math, to start to calculate. And we did that in 2007 first, and then in 2008 we actually were the first to put the climate labels on the menus our guests could choose between different alternatives with low and high climate impact. But what it did when we really looked at the figures was that we understood that we had a beef with our own beef, and that beef had been our cash cow for 50 years almost. So you know, the next challenge was going into main business, core business. What could we do? So we have been selling more and more of green burgers, lacto-ovo vegetarian and vegan burgers to reduce our climate footprint. And we started off doing that in 2009 already, but it didn't work out fine. But in 2016, it started working like a charm. So now we've increased that market segment from 2% of total sales volume to 22% today. So that's an 1100% increase in 4 years, and it rapidly reduces our emissions.
Thanks,
but
guys.
we're still not going to feel like we're there yet. We're going to have to reduce our emissions 70% more to 2050. We know that, so it's far way to go, long way to go.
All right, let's come back to that in a minute. So Austin, obviously you, as I said, you play a different role, but you talk all the time to companies that are setting out on this journey, I imagine. So what are some of the themes that you're hearing from them?
Yeah, the supply chain, the value chain theme is front and center. Everything from, oh wow, I had no idea that was really something I should be thinking about, or that was going to be 90% or 90+% of my carbon footprint. So part of the journey that we're on is helping as many companies as we can to realize that all those things that are happening upstream when you place the order, for a container of goods coming from China, those are all really important and they're your responsibility too. And so signing up for that as part of this whole exercise to tame carbon footprints is really, really important. So I would say, yeah, just building that educational base has been a great part of the process over the last year and a half. We've also done a lot of work thinking about sort of the status quo and whom the status quo serves. And by that, I mean which companies have been among the most active and which companies have been sort of left out. And something we've discovered is that enterprises below, say, $1 billion in revenues are typically not at the table. And a lot of the largest coordinated efforts around carbon and climate have featured the multi-billion-dollar companies, the largest 10 companies in a given market, for example. But there are lots and lots of companies at the lower end that have very active and vibrant consumer followings and contribute significantly to the problem. And they need something to work on, and they need a way, they need a playbook. And so we think that by expanding kind of the market in some senses to companies down the size, down the food chain, we'll be able to have more of an impact as well. So yeah, plenty of other stuff we've learned, but those are two of the ones that are top of mind.
So let's get on to the Scopefree question that Erin raised. And as I said, I'm really glad you raised it, because as someone that looks quite a lot at commitments made by companies and tries to make sense of them, Scopefree can be one of the most frustrating areas. Companies will just ignore them, basically. They'll talk about their emissions, but they're not actually talking about their Scopefree emissions, which, as you said, can be an enormous component of a company's emissions. Or they'll set a goal for one component and kind of obscure that the goal for Scopefree is different. This is frustrating, and it's very, very confusing for everyone else who tries to make sense of what the company's doing. So I think there's a consensus here that when we're talking about emissions, that should include Scopefree emissions as well. But clearly those emissions they have sort of particular challenges that come with them, particularly for companies, even for companies that don't have many suppliers. But obviously the more suppliers you have, the more difficult it gets. Some of those suppliers may just not be interested in the business of cutting emissions. So I would love to hear, maybe starting with Erin, like how do you begin that process of engaging suppliers and bringing them with you and sort of like really generating real collaboration?
Sure. I mean, I agree with you. It's absolutely critical. And so, some of it you can start on the front end with your supply chain by building in requirements into your contracts that before you even finalize the supply chain relationship, have a bit of a section that says, we're going to require you to report on your emissions. And if you're not doing it now, we're going to ask you to establish that. So I think, the advice is start early, do it often, but don't stop there. So there's the formalization with your supplier relationship where you can do that, certainly in the contracting phase. The second thing you can do, again, I come from the perspective of a small company that's often one of the only ones asking their supply chain for this data. You can give them tools. So, one thing that we've been doing with some of our, top 10 suppliers from a carbon perspective is working with them in partnership with Manufacture 2030 to give them access to kind of an online environment where they can track projects that they're doing to reduce carbon and see the benefit there. So it's an idea that we're asking for data, but we're also giving you access to new tools to be able to do that. And those are collaborative tools that are not just going to help what you need to do for us, but may help your business, may help you see how other businesses are addressing that, for sure. So I think that's another way. A third strategy we've done, obviously, is we talk to our suppliers a lot. We have supplier summits. We're planning one for later this fall where we walk through our carbon strategy. We show our total footprint. And sometimes when you show a supplier, 98% of what we're doing here is because of the emissions that are coming from your raw materials, it's a pretty interesting education. And I think ultimately, it's not just awareness building, but it's also talking about our desire to continue to improve that and what they're going to need to do for us. So whether it's, kind of formalizing that in contracting, whether it's giving them access to better tools, whether it's just building awareness about the opportunities in their business, and in sometimes directly helping them. There are times when we've engaged with some of the most carbon heavy suppliers to actually help them assess their emissions. So I think you've got to have a box of tools, and depending on the size of the supplier, the sophistication, be ready to deploy those.
I'm curious as to whether there are sticks as well as carrots. Do you ever have to, or have you had to say to a supplier that this is just not going to work, I'm going to find someone else because you're not willing to make the reductions we need?
I think our best stick has been purchasing power. So, early on, we kind of said to suppliers, we need to see some lower carbon footprint nylon in our products. Nylon, the fuzzy stuff, the beautiful stuff in carpet tiles in particular is the stuff that tends to carry the biggest footprint when you look at all the raw materials in the product. And we had diverse suppliers at the time, and we said to them, we issue a challenge to you guys to provide a lower carbon footprint option, in this case, recycled nylon. And whoever provides that to us first, we will award you with more purchasing. And we will shift our portfolio maybe to one supplier, maybe to just two suppliers. And that's the closest we've come to actually saying, a stick, but I mean, it was real money. It was in one instance moving away from a supplier and taking our business away from them.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. And often, I guess, a lot of the companies that you work with, they also have purchasing power, but it maybe doesn't carry as much weight as it does at Interface. What does the challenge look like for them?
Well, I mean, I love what you said, Erin, because I feel like it's sort of a shift in thinking, like, from the I have buyer power force to oh wait, I have enablement power as a buyer, and it doesn't even matter if I'm your largest customer. I could be just a customer who is one among 30 that you serve, but I also have the ability to show you that, hey, there's this tool set, there's this information guide, there's some other things that I've learned elsewhere. So to enable your suppliers doesn't require you to be a $10 billion company. And we've definitely seen that with the smaller companies that we've worked with. We've also seen a lot of collaboration on the sustainability end of things. It's amazing to, like, within the sustainability community, to see how much people can be friends even when their companies are rivals. And so the sustainability teams who know that all their products are made within the same factory, it's just like, at 8 o'clock they stop making one product, and at 8:30 they start making the next product. They can go into those factories, work together, and say, look, I don't need to see the trade secrets of my competitors, but we would both like you to do things differently, because we know that you are contributing 30% or whatever the percentage is to our carbon emissions. The enablement thing is so powerful.
And Kai, you have a very different supply chain to Erin. So what does this look like? What are your relationships with suppliers like when you have these conversations?
I mean, we do many of the similar things and that Erin and Austin talked about. So maybe not all of them and not at the same time, but one thing that might be a little bit different for us is that we're actually changing suppliers. So we're saying, okay, you come up with a really good vegan protein here that we're going to use in our burgers, and the competitors don't have that. So we're switching to you, and we're saying sayonara to the other one. See you some other time, maybe. So that's also evolution of suppliers, and that's because in this area around vegan burgers, we have such a high innovation speed right now. So and we want to always come up with the tastiest burgers with the lowest climate impact. So from that perspective, we should also replace them.
Okay, so let's turn our attention to a sort of component of this discussion that has caused a lot of controversy, and that's carbon offsets. So there's so many different views out there. So maybe just like, let's start the conversation by telling, just explain like how your organization views the potential use or the use of offsets, or what that use can play in hitting your climate goals. And Kai, why don't you start?
Well, I actually had a picture that I don't know how to share. If someone else have that, we can share it. So I think
I'll see if I can find that and get that up for you while you're talking.
Okay, great. So it's actually about the theory of change that the International Panel of Climate Change has. So what is science telling us about what we need to do in the future? And it tells us that we need to reduce emissions. We've heard about that for a long time, but it also tells us that we need to capture carbon from the atmosphere. So we cannot reach the 1.5 degree target from Paris without capturing carbon from the air. And that is also called carbon offsetting. Carbon offsetting can be of different versions, but we desperately need to do those. So just let that sink in. We cannot reach the 1.5 degree target without offsets. So, and then we can start thinking about what kind of offsets we want. And that's going to be a different quality and different timing. And but I think one of the reasons what we're going into here is I don't need it anymore, Nick. I think I'm talked over it anyway. So thanks. So what? Yeah, there it is. Anyhow, so what basically these are 4 scenarios for the world, for everyone you love in it, and for the future of humanity. And so you will have the emissions in the gray field. You will have the captures in the brown and yellow field. So the brown one is agriculture, forestry, and other land use. I would say that's trees mainly today. And BECCS is bioenergy with carbon capture storage. But what science tells us is that the first 2 scenarios, P1 and P2, is no longer viable. It's P3 or P4. So without us making sure we develop this market for offsets and in the future, I don't think we'll have a chance to reach those goals. And any company that goes into carbon offsetting knows that it's a cost. They're investing in climate. They get a voluntary tax. And what we can see from different surveys is also that they actually reduce their emissions faster than companies that don't do offsetting. So it's a myth that we all need to kill now, because if we don't, it's going to hamper our opportunity to reach the 1.5 degree target.
And so Kai, just tell us a bit more about how you're using offsets then specifically.
Yeah, so we've been using tree planting, Plan Vivo certified, third-party verified. We know they mitigate poverty locally, they reduce erosion, they reduce drought. So they have these kind of local benefits as well. And sometimes people are thinking about trees and saying, but you can cut them down. Well, there are buffers, there are long-term contracts. Still, I do understand that this is not a perfect negative emission. A perfect negative emission, that would happen at the exactly same time as we had the first emission, and it would stay in the ground for millions of years. But right now, for us anyway, trees is the best way. Or actually, when we're looking at scale and negative emissions, it's the only way. So in the future, if we send a lot of money into this area and get innovation going, we will have those kind of BECCS on scale and the vacuum cleaners of the atmosphere and all of those things who might happen in the future.
Thanks, Kai. And I think you touched on different types of offsets there. And Austin, I wondered if maybe you could clarify that for the audience, because this can get confusing. We can pay, or organizations can pay to reduce emissions, and they can also pay to draw down carbon that's already in the atmosphere. Austin, do you want to unpack that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, two kind of types of projects can address emissions. Some of them avoid emissions that would have happened. A good example of that would be a renewable energy project, because instead of having a marginal megawatt hour from a coal plant, you've got that coming from a wind farm. So you're avoiding emissions that would have happened otherwise. So essentially you're kind of, pushing down the curve of emissions that would have been a little bit higher. On the other end of it, you've got projects that will capture emissions and sequester them. And that can range anything from planting a tree, as Kai said, to some of the more advanced and experimental technologies, like playing with minerals that will capture carbon on a beach, or big massive industrial scale facilities that will suck it out of the air. There's all kinds of research happening right now. So yeah, I mean, avoid or reduce, avoid or remove. And then within those, there are loads of different project types. And one of the things that we sort of fundamentally believe is that everybody needs to get past this point of discomfort, controversy. There's immorality in carbon offsetting. If you just look at the basic fact that carbon emissions are rising 2 or 3% per year, and carbon emissions need to be falling 7.5%, 8% per year, that is like an inconceivable shift in a curve. And every year that goes by that we don't do that, that goes from 7.5% or 8% to 8.5% or 9% or 10%. It gets harder and harder. And if we aren't investing immediately in as many of these types of projects, I don't care if it's avoidance or removal, do them all. Like, we need lots and lots and lots of money to be flowing into climate change solutions. End of story. And if people complain that it's a little bit uncomfortable because it's going to cost them, a fraction of a percent of revenues, and they'd rather be spending that in, in R&D for materials, do both, right? I mean, we need it all. And I sort of feel like a lot of the thinking around this is, oh, well, it's kind of immoral to be paying somebody else to do it when I should be doing it myself. Well, then do it yourself too. Right? Get the emissions down as much as possible. I think one of the things that we feel is like, if you structure the next 30 years around the assumption that everyone who promises to reduce their emissions to net zero by 2050, you will miss the target, because not every company will hit that goal. So you need to mitigate risk by doing things now, so that when you get to 2035 or 2040 and find that only some fraction of companies have actually hit their goal, that you at least have the insurance of having invested in as much mitigation, whether it's removal or avoidance, as you possibly can, and just drive money into decarbonization. I mean, that's just what it takes.
I think
and the beautiful thing, if you do that, is that in the long run, you can also help to reverse global warming if we have those technologies. And that's really the most sensible goal humanity can have. To not accept 1.5 degree in the long run, but actually reduce them afterwards. And then those kind of offsets is key. We can't do it without it.
So Erin, I want to come to you, but just one quick question for Aster, because I think you hit one issue there that's caused controversy, which is kind of like you're buying, companies are buying the way out of the problem, not doing the hard work themselves, which I totally agree is an issue. And we need to do both. There's another issue I think that's got people worried about offsets, and that's the sense that, and you alluded to this, Kai, a company spends the money on an offset which doesn't deliver the carbon benefits that it's supposed to. Maybe the forest gets chopped down and used for timber. Maybe there's some other problem. The accounting doesn't pan out in the way that we'd hoped. And I know, Austin, at Climate Neutral, you think about this and you help the companies you work with to invest wisely. Just tell us about like maybe one or two sort of key principles that you think about when you're working with your companies and helping them to invest in offsets.
Yeah, I mean, we built a framework that we feel kind of curates what's out there into the lowest risk projects, and that framework evolves every year with input of a dozen stakeholders who are involved in carbon offset markets. I think we firmly believe that the market has evolved and improved considerably over the last decade. We also firmly believe that it's not perfect today, and it needs to continue to improve. So we're in touch with and working with a whole bunch of different entities that are looking at ways to apply new types of technologies to ensure project permanence and new thinking around additionality and all those really important things that people know need to happen to create a quality carbon offset. I mean, I think, you know, fundamentally, just because the market isn't perfect today doesn't mean that we shouldn't invest in making it better. And I think there are a lot of people who say, well, it's not perfect, so we need to walk away and find something else. Let's just put all our efforts in policy. I'm sorry that policy is just not going to happen in the quick enough, you know, time period. So yeah, not that we shouldn't keep working for it, but in the meantime, again, we need to be doing things to make the market better. So I mean, some of the things that we do, we restrict vintage years to more recent vintage years. We require diversity of project types so that you're not just investing.
Explain, Austin, just explain what vintage year is.
Yeah, vintage year would be the year in which the carbon, you know, the carbon credit was produced. So basically, if I have a forestry project, effectively, you know, the carbon that was sucked up by that forest in 2018 would be a 2018 vintage year carbon credit. And that applies to any project that, you know, will often be a multi-year project, and, you know, over the course of that project, it's producing carbon credits based on the carbon benefits that it's providing. So vintage year restrictions, we require verification by third-party entities that look after carbon offset projects and check out whether they meet the basic criteria. And as I said, project portfolio diversification. So some of the things that we look for, you know, are designed to, again, mitigate risk. The market that I often compare the offset market to is the energy efficiency market, which in the US is a $10 billion market where we collect lots of money from people who pay their utility bills and then put it out into efficiency projects. Not every one of those projects delivers the efficiency benefits that it is supposed to, but on average, on balance, it definitely has reshaped electricity demand permanently in the US and has opened up all kinds of opportunities for clean energy. So I think we're sort of at the early years of that and really need to think hard and well about how we make the market better.
Thanks, Austin. Sorry, I just lost, I'm just having internet problems here, but I hope you can all still hear me. So Erin, I want to go to you, but just quickly, just to encourage people to add questions to the chat, because we'd love to move over to getting some audience questions as soon as possible. But Erin, tell us about the role that offsets have played in your journey at Interface.
Sure. I mean, we've been using them for many, many years. So kind of our philosophy has been set a really bold ambition, start, you know, reducing in-house, taking action, and you know, to the extent that there are things that you cannot immediately identify for reduction to get to zero, offsets are okay. So, you know, I think we should not shame companies for using them. If they are legitimate, if they are, you know, meeting a legitimate third-party verified standard that we think is credible, why would we want to discourage companies from reducing carbon from the atmosphere? I mean, why? You know, so I think there was always this argument that, you know, there are companies who will just continue to pollute and then use offsets. I can never figure out who those theoretical companies are, because every company that I know that's using offsets has made a net zero commitment. And even if they start, like I'm thinking of some of the companies like Lyft or Uber, even if they start by saying we're carbon neutral today, heavily based on offsets, they all have an intention and have put themselves on the hook to reduce that purchase of offsets over time, and let their customers, let the market, you know, let the market determine whether or not that's a legitimate way to do it. Because here's the reality. We don't want to discourage a company from being net zero tomorrow with offsets if it's 5 times more expensive for them to reduce in-house. And that was the whole reason, offsets were created and recognized in the regulated markets. It was this idea that there is going to be a point in time where it's too expensive, it's too hard, or it takes too long to make these reductions in country, in company, somewhere else, right? There just gets to be a point where it's too expensive. And if I can do that by supporting a wind project or a more efficient stove project in India that also has health benefits, that also has all these co-benefits, we ought to encourage that. And so, I think the debate is kind of waning and going away on that. I used to get questions all the time when they say, well, in 2018, we announced all of our products are carbon neutral as a standard attribute everywhere. And I used to get questions all the time, and people would say, well, are you guys using offsets? And I would say, we've reduced the carbon footprint, carpet tile products, 74%. 74%. And we're using offsets for the rest. And that still wasn't okay. At which point you just kind of have to smile and say, I appreciate your perspective, but we're moving on. And I kind of feel like that's where we are on this debate now, right? It's just time to move on.
Yeah, I totally agree. And sometimes I make the thought experiment about individuals in Sweden. The average Swede has 10 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions every year. And if they work really, really hard, they live in a small apartment, don't own any car, only eat vegan, they're going to go down to 5, maybe 4. So what would they do with the rest? It is hard to reduce emissions. That's how it is right now. And it's going to take decades before that happens because everyone is dependent on everyone. But what we can do now is to get the kind of climate mitigation we get from offsetting. So both. It's both, like all of you said. We need to do both.
Great, thanks, Kai and Erin. And I think like framing that in terms of like a person's decision is super interesting. Kai, I hadn't thought about that, but that is, I think, Erin, when you get that kind of level of skepticism, which must be maddening if you manage to cut your footprint by 70%, that's a really nice way of sort of helping people think about the problem.
I like that. I'm going to use that in the future.
And the thing is, as an individual, if you're supposed to go down to 1 ton for the 2050 lifestyle. But before you wake up in the morning as a Swede, you have a government, you have roads, you have fire department, and that's 2 tons. So you can never reach it yourself. So that's just, and I would encourage so many people listening to this, do carbon offsetting for you personally. It will drive your change because you will know every year how much it costs you, and you know why it costed that because you made the climate analysis. And when you saw that climate analysis, you understood what were the big things you were doing and what were the small things you were doing, and then you got creative about reducing them. So this is a perfect tango, I think. We need to do both.
Great, thanks everyone. So I want to get to audience questions. Nick, you want to say something quickly, I think, about science-based targets? Actually, Nick, also, I'm not seeing the audience questions come through on my panel. I don't know why.
I will help you guys with that.
So you might have to help. Thank you.
I did want to throw in just a few quick questions to kind of sort of summarize where we've gotten. This has been terrific so far, and is exactly what I was hoping we were going to talk about. And then we'll jump into the questions, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. I promised no PowerPoints, but I'm going to throw up one slide here real quick. You'll notice that this is very similar to the slide that Kai's put up earlier. To the extent that there is kind of an official arbiter on what is and what isn't net zero, that would be coming from the Science Based Targets Initiative. This graph kind of summarizes the path to getting there, to this hypothetical goal. What you need to understand is that there are 4 basic guidelines in terms of getting there according to science-based targets, and we more or less follow these guidelines ourselves. Number 1 is real simple. You set your target, your net zero target. That's going to be based on science with some milestones along the way. This has to be consistent with the 1.5 degree pathway. Number 2, as the panel has very diligently noted, is to find those actual physical opportunities to reduce emissions inside of your value chain. through efficiency, technology, policy, so on and so forth. Number 3 is the financing of carbon projects along the way. That most definitely can include offsets and is in fact encouraged to include offsets despite the handful of nuance that we went into. It could also include removal projects as well, of course. And then finally, when you ultimately achieve that goal, you have to be, you've gotten your emissions down to that point where you have a certain amount of what they call avoidable residual emissions that you can't do anything about. And that's where the removal projects come into play. So at that point, when you've reached that goal, offsets no longer a part of the picture, but they are most definitely a critical piece of the transition towards getting there. So hopefully that was nice and clear. And I'm just going to go down the questions here. We have a lot, so please keep them coming in. And we're just going to go down through in order. I'm going to attempt to consolidate a few of these because there's a handful that are a little bit similar. Question number 1 is from Simon. How do organizations strike a balance between what is required globally and what they believe their operation will accept when setting targets? And whoever.
I mean, I can start. I think,
and we can keep our answers relatively brief, and we'll get to as many as we can.
Yeah, at this point, I think it's pretty accepted that net zero is the floor. So I think when we're talking about sort of like what's needed globally, the two things are, I think it's becoming clear that net zero is the floor from which we build to say it's net zero plus it's removal plus it's something else. So I think that's pretty well established. But the other thing I would say is, there's a lot of benefit associated with setting the most ambitious target possible. Look at what we've just seen over the last 5 years in terms of companies setting carbon neutral commitments and us now realizing that that's actually not going to be good enough to sort of achieve the global levels of carbon we need. So I would say aim as high as possible to the point where it's uncomfortable, because it has to be relevant to stand the test of time for 5 years, at least.
Anyone else want to comment on that one?
I can just say that we're doing this voluntarily. We don't do it because someone is expecting us to do it. We do it because we think that the biggest thing we can do is to inspire others to do more. We should all be ambitious and just drive up this the spirit of change.
I guess, Nick, maybe I would flip that question around and say, what's the capacity that your company has for not doing this? And to what extent will your customers just disapprove? I mean, like Erin said, if net zero is the new floor, it's not about having capacity to do something. It's about deciding whether you want to test whether it's okay not to do something. And if you don't, what risk you're taking with customers or for larger companies, shareholders, and the broader kind of stakeholder community.
Yeah, Max is a family-owned company. We want to be family-owned for 4 generations. And if that's going to happen, we need a business model that's in line with what society needs. So what do society need? And if we can find that business model, it's just safer for this family.
We have a number of questions on Scope 3, how we handle Scope 3 in this journey. I'm going to kind of consolidate them into one. This is a kind of a classic question. It still kind of confounds me a little bit, but how do we reconcile the fact that multiple businesses may share suppliers? And if multiple businesses are counting these suppliers through their Scope 3 emissions, how do you prevent overestimating what needs to be offset or accounted for?
I would love to start off with that one because I think that will be a problem the day when we go below 350 ppm. When we have captured so much carbon from the atmosphere that we're kind of are within safe limits already and are thinking about, are we going too low now? Maybe we'll think about that kind of double counting then. But right now, everyone has to do as much as they can.
I mean, I think there are accounting rules for that, but I think the first is transitioning your suppliers from this idea that they're giving you estimated data or you're estimating versus calculated data. So, you know, we know how many, for example, pounds of nylon we buy from our largest supplier, just like you would know how many pounds of ground beef or tofu or, you know, whatever you're buying from the supply chain, and each pound of that raw material has a carbon footprint. Sometimes it has to be calculated with a life cycle assessment versus estimated. But you know, I think when we started to dig into understanding our scope 3, you know, you start from the biggest areas. So if those, you know, there's those 18 categories of stuff under scope 3, right? You know, your financial services, your purchased raw materials, all these different categories. You can pretty easily pick out what are the top 5. So if we're worried about potential double counting on scope 3, that might be down into the details, but I would say get your biggest carbon footprint from your heaviest carbon suppliers right, and worry about that first. And if this is a sophisticated supplier, they're going to be able to tell you, you know, how to make that pound calculation, and it's a pretty easy number. So we've just done our scope 3 and made those emissions public. You can look on Interface's investor relations website. We have a climate disclosure document, and you can see the categories of our scope 3 that have the biggest piece, and you can actually see there's about 5 that you really have to get right. So I would say to people, it can be confusing. Transition from calculated data, or from estimated to calculated, and focus on like the top 5 in your scope 3 that really make sense, and dig deep.
Good. Couple questions on insetting as a concept, as sort of somewhat distinct from offsetting. Can you identify any successful insetting projects that you or any of your companies have used to have applied inside of your value chain? Insetting essentially being offsetting within that supply chain, within your value chain.
I can't say we have when it comes to numbers. It's more in a pilot project. So we, you know, together with Swedish farmers, we do research around how biochar could be added to agriculture, to earth, and how that could even increase productivity of that soil. But that's where we are. And I think right now, since the rules for insetting is not standard yet, so we don't really know how we should calculate that in a proper way either. We haven't really put a strong focus on that, but I'm hoping we will in the future. We're looking into it at least.
We haven't.
And I mean, when the rules are there, I think it's going to be so much easier to think about it. So right now, it feels like you're kind of cheating since the rules aren't there anyway. So, but I think it's going to be important.
Yeah, we've had a couple requests. Go ahead, Jim.
Sorry, go on, Austin.
Briefly, we've had a couple questions from folks whether they can count hypothetical insetting projects toward the neutrality requirement, and come back to that question of is this yet scalable, is it verified? And in every case so far the answer has been no, which isn't to say it couldn't happen, it just needs to be documented better.
Yeah, Kai, I just wanted to say, I think that kind of approach, like identifying partners in the supply chain and collaborating with them to answer questions, it can be so powerful. It's not insetting to the extent that like maybe you just don't know what the carbon benefits are going to be, but particularly when it comes to agriculture, there are huge open questions there, and playing that role as a research partner to answer those questions actually probably moves us forward way faster than trying to figure out some relationship where you can have like a neat amount of carbon that you reduce with your supplier.
A question on effective first steps for smaller scale businesses. It's often a harder sell. It's often, certainly people may philosophically see the value, but it may be there may be less customer demand, et cetera. But smaller businesses, what are their any advice for them if they choose to take this path?
I mean, I think that one of the first steps is just understand the data, like understand your impact. I mean, everything flows from there. And I'm not opposed to some of these companies who say we want to start being net zero, or we want to start as a carbon neutral business, and the vast majority of that is offsets while they're learning. It's better than saying we want to be carbon neutral 5 years from now. And we're going to reduce 20%, and then 5 years from now, we're going to be carbon neutral. So I think, if your first step is making a really ambitious commitment and taking an action, I think it's okay if offsets are one of those first actions, right? I think that's absolutely okay. I think next step action, certainly if you're a small manufacturer, for us, one of the biggest and easiest was just operational efficiency, and what's so great about that is you're engaging employees to come up with those solutions. I mean, the best solutions on how we waste less, move things faster, set, different machine settings, all of those things have to engage the people on the factory floor who are the best owners and, creatives on that knowledge. So, first it's kind of take the ambitious action, take the ambitious sort of pledge. And then, maybe an easy step is operational efficiency in your operations or in your office. If you're in an office environment, do something like buy renewable energy. I think there's loads of easy steps.
So we talk with a lot of startups who are in exactly that position that you mentioned, Erin. Well, we just launched this company a year ago. We want to do things right. And yeah, I guess on one hand, you could sort of laugh at them and be like, what are you going to do? You're a 1-year-old startup, and who knows if you'll be in business in a year. But like, think about how unusual that would have been 15 years ago for, the average entrepreneur who's just taking a gamble with his savings to launch a company and saying, I want this company to have climate change be one of the driving forces around how we make our investment decisions and our financial decisions and our brand decisions. That's pretty great. I mean, and I think it signals just a really important turn has happened in how businesses think about, their responsibility to the globe and to society. So I mean, our hope is that by working with some of these small brands in 5 years, there will be, there'll be 100 million or billion-dollar brands that will have disrupted the more slow-moving companies and kind of kick them out of the market. And yeah.
We are getting close to the hour. If anyone does have to jump, feel free. If those who were able to stay, we could go through 3 or 4 more questions. I'm happy to stick around. We had a couple of questions concerning carbon capture technologies and some of the high-tech solutions to potentially removing carbon from the atmosphere. I know we touched on this briefly, but curious, do you guys think that we're going to get there anytime soon in terms of some of the things that companies like Climeworks are working on, and there are others out there as well?
I mean, I'll weigh in on that. Not being in a sector where direct air capture is going to be something that's going to help us go carbon negative. I mean, we're more in the what are the new raw materials we can use or add to products that store carbon to make products carbon negative or to make operations negative. I'm sort of in the middle, but from a cost perspective, right, I feel like there's everything we can do in ag supply chains, in forestry, that represent a much lower, but maybe a little bit riskier bet on carbon removal and sequestration. In the middle is those materials and technologies. And then on the far end, in terms of cost, is this direct air capture. So as cool and science fiction-y as that still is to me, it's still incredibly expensive. And I still don't see where it plugs in to kind of the vast majority of companies that need this solution, because at that price, how are we able to play? So it feels like you know, for a company like ours and looking to make investments now over the next 15 years to get to carbon negative, we're playing much more in the materials ag end of it, just from a cost perspective. But I'm super hopeful that people will see what's going on with Climeworks. They'll find ways to commercialize that. There'll be, you know, things that you can do on manufacturing plants that are direct air capture, but I can't estimate how long off that's going to be.
I have to jump off now, so I'm just going to say quick thanks to Nick for organizing, for everyone for taking part in the panel. That was a great discussion.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Hi, Jim.
Thanks so much, Jim.
Bye. See you. I just want to remind people that there's an extremely advanced machine that builds itself and collects carbon from the air. It's called a tree.
A tree.
What we know now is that we're cutting down forests all over the planet. So we absolutely need to get those back. So when it comes to volume and carbon capture or carbon sequestration, trees, that's it. And I think the next one that will work on scale, a fair amount of scale, is BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture storage. What it is you take the old oil drill holes and you fill them with carbon that you've taken from biofuels of different versions. And that's already happening on fair amount of scale today. It's a little bit annoying in one way, because the old oil companies kind of made us pay for oil many times over. First, we emit it into the atmosphere, and then we're going to pay them to put it back there. So, but I still think it's a good way to go. And in the future, I see big oil needs to turn into big suck. So they need to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. And I think that scale of companies with big oil, that's what we need in the future with big suck. And irrespective if that's super high tech or not, I hope that's what we're going to see.
Good. One topic that surprisingly hasn't come up yet, perhaps not, because we are all such leaders here. The role of government is a very loaded question, especially right here in the United States. But what hypothetically can and should government do to make this easier for everybody?
I think I was the one to bring up policy earlier, so. Oh, did I interrupt you, Erin?
No, go ahead.
You're on.
No, okay. I think we got okay. Yeah, I think I was the one to bring up policy earlier, and having worked in climate policy and energy efficiency policy, I guess I firmly believe that we need policy, and firmly believe that we need to assume policy won't happen. And partly that's born out of just looking back at what happened a decade ago when we thought we'd have good climate policy in the US and what that would have looked like, meaning it almost passed. If it had passed, it would have really started to have teeth this year, and that was 10 years. And so if we were to tomorrow pass the exact same policy, we'd be looking at 2030 before those teeth started to dig in. And that's because there's a lot of jockeying that goes into the policy process when people are trying to figure out who shoulders the responsibility. And it's a difficult thing. And usually the beginning of those implementation periods is just meant to get everybody on board and give people time to adjust. So yeah, we should definitely still keep working for policy. I guess I chafe a little bit when people say, well, policy is the permanent structural change that we need, because if you look at what happened with the Clean Power Plan in the US, that was not a permanent structural change. It was implemented and then, or started to be implemented and then reversed. So unfortunately, as the political winds blow, policy can change. It's not immutable. And so, yes, we need to chase it. We need to still absolutely try to influence how people think about the importance of voting. But we also need to plan as if it's not going to happen.
We got one more question.
One thing I would encourage companies to think about is there's sort of like big policy change.
I think we had a little bit of audio glitch there. Erin, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
There's a glitch.
No?
Network slow down.
Can you hear me? Let's try again. Hold on.
Now I can.
Now can you hear me? Yeah, I'm not getting any audio.
Check. Well, we did a whole hour with next to no glitches, and then all of a sudden, off we go. That may be an invitation to wrap it. If you guys may or may not still hear me. Guys, this was a terrific conversation. We did have a couple of questions hanging here. We'll do our best to pass those questions around. We'll also have a recording of this. We're going to send everybody a nice follow-up email after at some point next week. We certainly hope that we'll have a chance to do this again. And I want to thank everybody for turning up, and we will keep this conversation going. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Nice.
Thank you.
Great to be here. Thanks for putting it on, Nick.